The snow fell in thick sheets across the Afghan mountains, turning the rocky landscape into a deadly maze of white. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun pressed herself against the frozen stone, her breath forming small clouds in the bitter December air. Through her scope, she watched the valley below where 200 of America's finest warriors were trapped in what would become known as the Christmas Eve siege. Sarah had been in position for 6 hours, hidden in a cave high above the valley floor. Her spotter, Corporal Jake Morrison, lay beside her with his rangefinder and radio. They were the only hope for the massive SEAL team caught in the ambush below. The mission had started as a simple extraction operation, but intelligence had been wrong. Dead wrong. The SEALs had walked into a carefully planned trap. What should have been a routine mission to extract a high-value target had turned into a nightmare when over 1,000 enemy fighters surrounded them in the narrow valley. The mountains on all sides made escape impossible, and winter weather had grounded all air support. The only way out was through, but the enemy held every advantage. Sarah watched through her scope as explosions lit up the valley floor. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked through the air, and machine gun fire echoed off the canyon walls. The SEALs had formed a defensive perimeter around 3 large boulders, but they were running low on ammunition. Radio chatter filled her earpiece with desperate calls for support. "Phoenix 1, this is Overwatch," Sarah spoke into her radio. "I have eyes on your position. Count 200 friendlies, approximately 1,000 enemy fighters surrounding your perimeter." "Overwatch, Phoenix 1, came the reply from Commander Mike Torres, leading the trapped force. "We're taking heavy casualties. Ammunition running critically low. Request immediate support." Sarah studied the battlefield through her powerful scope. The enemy had positioned themselves perfectly, using the natural terrain to create overlapping fields of fire. Heavy machine guns were dug into positions on 3 sides of the valley, making any movement impossible for the trapped Americans. Mortar teams were systematically targeting the SEAL positions, forcing them to stay low and unable to return effective fire. The enemy commander had chosen his position well. The valley was a natural kill zone, shaped like a horseshoe with only one narrow entrance. That entrance was now blocked by enemy fighters with heavy weapons. The SEALs were completely cut off, with their backs against a sheer cliff face that rose straight up for 300 feet. Sarah had been watching the battle develop for hours, taking careful notes on enemy positions and movement patterns. Her job was to provide intelligence and precision fire support, but with so many enemy fighters spread across such a wide area, even her exceptional marksmanship skills could only do so much. She needed to find the key target that would change everything. Through her scope, she studied the enemy command structure. Most of the fighters were local Taliban and foreign militants, but there was organization to their movements that suggested professional military leadership. Someone was coordinating this attack with precision and skill that went beyond typical insurgent capabilities. "Morrison, you see that ridge line at 2 o'clock from the SEAL position?" Sarah whispered to her spotter. Jake adjusted his rangefinder and studied the area. "Yeah, I see movement up there. Looks like command and control position." Sarah shifted her scope to examine the ridge more carefully. There, partially hidden behind a large rock formation, she could see figures with radio equipment and what appeared to be maps or tablets. This was the nerve center of the enemy operation. But the distance was extreme, even for her specially modified rifle. The wind was gusting unpredictably through the mountain passes, making any long-range shot extremely difficult. Sarah had made shots at this distance before, but never under these conditions, and never with so much depending on the outcome. The fate of 200 American warriors rested on her ability to make an impossible shot. As darkness began to fall, the enemy increased their attack intensity. Flares lit up the sky, casting eerie shadows across the snow-covered battlefield. The sound of incoming mortars mixed with the constant chatter of automatic weapons. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from dozens of positions as the enemy tightened their grip on the trapped Americans. The SEALs were running out of time. Their ammunition supplies were critically low, and casualties were mounting. Medical supplies were almost gone, and the bitter cold was sapping their strength with each passing hour. Sarah knew that without immediate action, the entire force would be overrun before dawn. She had identified 17 key enemy positions that needed to be eliminated to create a corridor for escape. But, even working continuously, she could not engage them all before the seals were overrun. She needed to find a different solution, something that would change the entire dynamic of the battle. Through her scope, she noticed something that made her heart race. On the command ridge, one figure stood apart from the others. He was taller, wearing different equipment, and clearly giving orders to the other fighters. Radio antennas extended from his position, and she could see him gesturing toward the trapped Americans while speaking into a handheld device. This was the enemy commander, and eliminating him might throw their coordinated attack into chaos. But the shot was at the absolute limit of her rifle's effective range, in deteriorating weather conditions, with unpredictable wind patterns. Miss, and she would give away her position to the enemy. Hit, and she might save 200 American lives. Sarah calculated the distance at 1,247 meters, well beyond what most snipers would even attempt. The wind was gusting from multiple directions as it swirled through the mountain passes. The target was partially concealed and moving occasionally, making the shot even more difficult. But she had trained for moments like this her entire career. The radio crackled with another transmission from the trapped SEALs. Overwatch, Phoenix 1. We're down to less than 10 minutes of ammunition. Enemy is massing for final assault. If you're going to do something, it has to be now. Sarah took a deep breath and began her final preparations. She adjusted her scope for the extreme range and calculated the wind compensation needed for the shot. Her finger found the trigger as she settled into her firing position. Everything she had trained for had led to this moment on Christmas Eve in the mountains of Afghanistan. The lives of 200 American warriors depended on her ability to make the most difficult shot of her career. Through her scope, the enemy commander came into view as he moved between positions, coordinating the final assault that would overwhelm the trapped Americans. Sarah's breathing slowed as she prepared to take the shot that everyone feared she might have to make. In the distance, she could hear the enemy fighters shouting commands as they prepared for their final push. Time was running out, and the moment of decision had arrived. Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger as she prepared to fire the shot that would either save her fellow Americans or doom them all. The wind gusted again through the mountain pass, and Sarah waited for the brief moment of calm that would give her the best chance of success. Through her scope, the enemy commander raised his radio to his lips, preparing to give the order for the final assault. This was her moment. Sarah's breathing stopped as she prepared to fire. The scope crosshairs settled on the target, and her finger began the final trigger squeeze that would determine the fate of the battle. In the valley below, 200 American warriors waited for salvation that could only come from her rifle. The shot that everyone feared was about to be taken. The rifle bucked against Sarah's shoulder as the .338 Lapua Magnum round left the barrel at 2,950 feet per second. The suppressor reduced the muzzle flash to a brief flicker, but the sound still echoed across the mountain peaks. For 3 seconds that felt like eternity, the bullet traveled through the thin mountain air toward its target. Through her scope, Sarah watched the enemy commander's head snap backward as the round found its mark. He dropped instantly, his radio falling into the snow beside him. The other fighters around him stared in shock for a moment before chaos erupted across the enemy positions. Hit confirmed, Sarah whispered into her radio. Enemy commander is down. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Without their leader's coordinating voice on the radio, the carefully orchestrated attack began to fall apart. Different groups of fighters started acting independently, no longer following a unified plan. Some positions stopped firing entirely as local leaders tried to figure out what had happened. Commander Torres's voice came through the radio with barely controlled excitement. Outstanding shot, Overwatch. Enemy fire is decreasing. We're seeing confusion in their ranks. Sarah quickly shifted her scope to identify the next priority target. With the command structure disrupted, she needed to exploit the momentary confusion to eliminate key weapon positions. A heavy machine gun nest on the eastern ridge had been causing the most casualties among the trapped SEALs. The machine gun position was manned by 3 fighters and positioned behind reinforced rocks. Sarah could see the muzzle flash clearly, but the shooters were well protected. She would need to wait for one of them to expose himself for a clean shot. Jake Morrison adjusted his rangefinder and called out the distance. Machine gun nest, 890 meters, wind from the northwest at 8 miles per hour. Sarah made her adjustments and settled in to wait. Patience was crucial in sniper operations, but with American lives hanging in the balance, every second felt like an hour. Finally, one of the machine gunners moved to reload, exposing his upper body for just a moment. The second shot was easier than the first, and the machine gunner dropped immediately. The heavy weapon fell silent, creating a gap in the enemy's defensive line. Sarah could see several SEALs immediately taking advantage of the opening to move to better positions. But the enemy was adapting quickly. Without their original commander, a new leader was emerging from their ranks. Sarah could see increased radioactivity from a different position on the western slope. The new commander was trying to restore order and resume the coordinated attack. Through her scope, Sarah studied this new threat. The replacement leader was being more careful than his predecessor, staying in covered positions and communicating primarily by radio rather than exposing himself to direct fire. This would be a more difficult target to eliminate. The battle in the valley continued to rage as both sides adjusted their tactics. The SEALs were using the temporary confusion to redistribute their remaining ammunition and treat their wounded. Medics worked frantically to stabilize casualties while other team members maintained defensive positions. Sarah realized that eliminating individual targets, while helpful, was not going to be enough to save the trapped force. She needed to create a more significant disruption that would allow the SEALs to break out of the valley entirely. Looking through her scope at the overall battlefield, she began to formulate a more ambitious plan. The enemy had positioned fuel and ammunition supplies in a central location about 600 meters from the main fighting positions. Several drums of fuel were stacked near wooden crates that likely contained explosives and ammunition. If she could ignite those supplies, the resulting explosion might create enough chaos for the SEALs to escape. But hitting a fuel drum with a rifle round would not necessarily cause an explosion. She needed to create sparks or heat that would ignite the fuel vapors. Sarah remembered something from her demolitions training about tracer rounds and fuel ignition. Her rifle was loaded with standard ammunition, but Jake Morrison carried a different weapon system. "Morrison, you still have those incendiary rounds for your rifle?" Sarah asked her spotter. Jake checked his equipment bag. "Yeah, got about 10 rounds left." "What?" Sarah explained her plan to target the enemy supply area. If they could create a large enough explosion, it would not only eliminate enemy ammunition, but also create smoke and confusion that the SEALs could use to cover their escape. The plan was risky because it would require multiple precise shots at a difficult target. The fuel and ammunition dump was partially protected by earthen barriers, but Sarah could see exposed areas where incendiary rounds might be effective. The challenge would be hitting the target area repeatedly while enemy fighters tried to locate and eliminate their position. "We'll have to displace immediately after the shots," Sarah told Jake. "Once we start that fire, every enemy fighter in the valley is going to be looking for us." Jake nodded and prepared his rifle with the special incendiary ammunition. These rounds contained a small amount of thermite that would burn intensely upon impact, hopefully hot enough to ignite fuel vapors or detonate explosive materials. Sarah continued to provide precision fire against individual targets while Jake prepared for the supply dump attack. She eliminated 2 more enemy fighters who were setting up a mortar position, buying additional time for their plan to work. Each shot revealed their general position to the enemy, making their situation more dangerous. The new enemy commander was proving to be competent and aggressive. He had reorganized the attack and was pushing fighters closer to the SEAL positions. Sarah could see enemy movement in areas that had been quiet earlier, indicating that the temporary confusion was ending. Time was running out for both plans. The SEALs were down to their last magazines of ammunition, and the enemy was preparing for another coordinated assault. Sarah needed Jake to make his shots count, because they would likely only get one chance at the supply area. Through her scope, Sarah could see the enemy supply area clearly. Multiple fuel drums were stacked near ammunition crates, all positioned in a natural depression that would contain and focus any explosion. If Jake could hit the target area with several incendiary rounds in quick succession, The resulting blast might be spectacular enough to change the entire battle. The radio crackled with another urgent transmission from Commander Torres. Overwatch. Enemy is massing for final assault. We're down to less than 5 minutes of ammunition. Whatever you're planning, execute now. Sarah made her decision. Morrison, take the shot. Multiple rounds. Rapid fire on the supply area. I'll cover you and engage any threats that emerge. Jake settled into his firing position and acquired his target through the scope. The distance was moderate for his weapon system, but the target area was small and partially obscured. He would need to walk his rounds into the target zone and hope that one of them found something flammable. Engaging supply area now, Jake announced as he fired his first incendiary round. The round struck near the fuel drums, but failed to create an immediate ignition. Jake adjusted his aim and fired again, this time hitting one of the drums directly. Still no explosion, but Sarah could see liquid beginning to leak from the punctured container. The third shot hit a wooden ammunition crate, sending splinters flying and creating a small fire among the supplies. The fourth round struck another fuel drum, and suddenly, the entire area erupted in a massive fireball that lit up the night sky. The explosion was far larger than either Sarah or Jake had expected. Secondary detonations sent flaming debris hundreds of feet into the air as stored ammunition cooked off in the intense heat. The blast was so powerful that Sarah felt the shock wave even from her position over half a mile away. Enemy fighters throughout the valley stopped shooting and stared at the massive fire burning in their supply area. Ammunition continued to explode sporadically, sending tracer rounds streaking in random directions. The light from the fire illuminated the entire battlefield, creating both opportunity and danger for everyone involved. Commander Torres immediately recognized the opportunity and began issuing orders over the radio. All Phoenix elements, this is Phoenix 1. Use the fire as cover and begin movement toward Rally Point Alpha. Move now while they're distracted. The SEALs began their breakout attempt, using the confusion and changed lighting conditions to move toward a predetermined escape route. But the fire that was helping them escape was also making Sarah and Jake's position much more visible to enemy fighters who were now actively searching for the snipers responsible for the attack. The massive explosion had created the diversion that Commander Torres needed, but it also painted a target on Sarah and Jake's position. Enemy fighters were now actively searching the surrounding ridges for the snipers who had caused such devastating damage to their operation. Sarah watched through her scope as groups of enemy fighters began moving up the mountainsides, using flashlights and flares to search for hidden positions. The glow from the burning supply dump created dancing shadows that made movement difficult to track, but she could see at least 30 fighters heading in their general direction. Time to move, Sarah told Jake as she began packing her rifle. They'll be here in less than 10 minutes. Jake was already gathering his equipment and destroying any evidence of their position. They had prepared 3 alternate firing positions earlier, connected by routes that would keep them hidden from observation in the valley. The nearest alternate position was 400 meters away across treacherous mountain terrain. As they prepared to move, Sarah maintained radio contact with the SEALs attempting their breakout below. Through her scope, she could see small groups of Americans moving through the firelight and shadows, trying to reach the rally point while enemy attention was focused on the burning supplies. Phoenix elements, this is Overwatch, Sarah transmitted. Enemy search teams are moving up the eastern and western slopes looking for our position. You have approximately 15 minutes before they can redeploy to intercept your movement. Commander Torres acknowledged the transmission while leading his men through the dangerous terrain. The SEALs were carrying wounded teammates and had limited ammunition, making their escape extremely precarious. They needed to reach the rally point before enemy forces could reorganize and block their exit route. Sarah and Jake moved carefully along their predetermined escape route, using hand signals and night vision equipment to navigate the rocky terrain. The mountain path was covered with loose stones that could easily give away their position if they made too much noise. Every step had to be calculated and precise. Behind them, they could hear enemy fighters getting closer. Voices called out in multiple languages as the search teams coordinated their efforts. Flashlight beams swept across the mountainside, and Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before their former position was discovered. The alternate firing position was located in a natural cave formation that provided excellent concealment and fields of fire over multiple approaches. Sarah had selected it during her initial reconnaissance because it offered both tactical advantage and escape routes if they needed to move again. As they reached the alternate position, Jake immediately set up his equipment while Sarah established communication with the SEAL teams. Through her scope, she could see that some groups had successfully reached the rally point, but others were still exposed and moving through dangerous terrain. The enemy was beginning to adapt to the new situation. While some fighters continued searching for the sniper team, others were moving to block the obvious escape routes from the valley. The new enemy commander was proving to be tactically competent, adjusting his forces to counter the American breakout attempt. Sarah identified a group of enemy fighters moving to establish a roadblock at a critical mountain pass that the SEALs would need to traverse. If that position was reinforced, it would trap the Americans between the valley and the high mountain peaks, where winter weather would finish what the enemy fighters had started. "Morrison, see that pass at our 11 o'clock position?" Sarah pointed toward the narrow gap between two peaks. Jake studied the area through his scope. "Yeah, looks like they're setting up blocking positions. That's going to be a problem for our people." The blocking force consisted of approximately 20 fighters with heavy weapons, positioned to control the only practical route through the mountains. They were carrying machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades, more than enough firepower to stop the escaping SEALs. Sarah realized she had a choice to make. She could continue providing overwatch for the SEALs already moving through the valley, or she could engage the blocking force and clear the escape route. Both missions were critical, but she could not accomplish both simultaneously from her current position. The radio crackled with transmissions from SEAL teams spread across the mountainside. Some groups were making good progress toward the rally point, but others were running into increasing enemy resistance. The situation was becoming more complex by the minute as both sides maneuvered for advantage. "Phoenix 1, this is Overwatch," Sarah transmitted. "Enemy is establishing blocking positions at grid reference 2847. Recommend alternate route or immediate action to clear that position." Commander Torres studied his map before responding. "Overwatch, no alternate routes available. That pass is the only way out. Can you engage the blocking force?" Sarah calculated the distance to the pass at approximately 950 meters, well within range of her weapon system. The enemy fighters were positioned among rocks that provided some cover, but they were not expecting sniper fire from her current angle. She could probably eliminate several targets before they located her position, but engaging the blocking force would require sustained fire that would definitely reveal her location to the searching enemy teams. Once her position was compromised, she and Jake would have to move again, leaving the escaping SEALs without overwatch protection during the most dangerous part of their escape. Jake was monitoring radio traffic from the SEAL teams while Sarah considered her options. Suddenly, he grabbed her arm and pointed toward the valley floor. "Look at the main group. They're in trouble." Through her scope, Sarah could see that the largest group of SEALs, including several wounded men, had been spotted by enemy fighters near the burning supply area. A firefight was developing as the Americans tried to continue their escape while enemy forces moved to surround them. The group was led by Commander Torres himself, and they were carrying at least 6 wounded teammates who could not move quickly. They had taken cover behind some rocks, but their position was rapidly becoming untenable as more enemy fighters arrived. Sarah now faced an impossible choice. The SEALs at the rally point needed the blocking force eliminated to complete their escape. The main group in the valley needed immediate fire support to avoid being overrun. And the enemy search teams were closing in on her position, threatening to eliminate her ability to help either group. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Sarah realized that conventional sniper tactics would not be sufficient to save all the trapped Americans. She needed to find a way to maximize her impact with limited ammunition and time. Looking at the overall battlefield, Sarah noticed something that gave her an idea. The enemy fighters at the blocking position were using the high ground to coordinate with forces in the valley below. If she could eliminate their radio equipment and leadership, it might disrupt communication between different enemy groups. More importantly, The blocking position was located near another potential target that could create a significant distraction. Sarah could see what appeared to be a fuel depot or vehicle parking area near the pass, possibly containing trucks or equipment that enemy forces had used to reach their positions. "Morrison, you see those vehicles near the blocking position?" Sarah asked her spotter. Jake adjusted his rangefinder and studied the area. "Yeah, looks like maybe 6 or 7 trucks. Probably how they got their heavy weapons up there." Sarah began formulating a plan that would address multiple problems simultaneously. If she could eliminate the blocking force leadership and destroy their vehicles, it would not only clear the escape route, but also create another diversion that might allow the main SEAL group to escape from the valley. The plan would require precise timing and exceptional marksmanship under extreme pressure. Sarah would need to engage multiple targets in rapid succession while enemy forces were actively searching for her position. Miss any shot, and the entire plan would fail. The radio crackled with another urgent transmission from Commander Torres. "All stations, enemy is closing on our position. We need immediate fire support or we're going to be overrun." Sarah made her decision. She would engage the blocking force first to clear the escape route, then shift fire to support the main group if time permitted. It was a calculated risk, but the alternative was losing both groups to enemy action. "Morrison, prepare for rapid engagement of multiple targets," Sarah announced as she settled into her firing position. "We're going to clear that pass and hope it creates enough confusion to help everyone escape." Jake acknowledged and began calling out ranges and wind conditions for the blocking position targets. Through her scope, Sarah could see enemy fighters moving into their final positions, unaware that they were about to become targets themselves. The battle was about to enter its most critical phase, and everything depended on Sarah's ability to make multiple precise shots under impossible conditions. The lives of 200 American warriors hung in the balance as she prepared to engage the blocking force that stood between them and freedom. Sarah's first shot at the blocking position struck the enemy commander who was coordinating the roadblock. Through her scope, she watched him collapse as the other fighters scrambled for better cover. The sudden loss of their leader created immediate confusion among the blocking force. Without hesitation, Sarah shifted her aim to the radio operator who was trying to call for reinforcements. The second shot silenced the radio permanently, cutting off communication between the blocking force and other enemy units. The fighters at the pass were now isolated and unable to coordinate with forces in the valley below. Jake called out adjustments as Sarah engaged the heavy machine gun position. The gunner was protected by rocks, but she could see his muzzle flash clearly. When he shifted position to get a better angle on the approaching SEALs, Sarah's third shot eliminated the threat permanently. The blocking force was beginning to panic as their numbers were reduced by an invisible enemy they could not locate. Some fighters abandoned their positions and began moving toward better cover, while others fired wildly in different directions, trying to locate the source of the deadly accurate fire. Through her scope, Sarah could see SEAL teams beginning to move through the pass that was no longer effectively defended. The elimination of the blocking force leadership had created the opening they needed to escape from the valley. But her sustained fire had also revealed her approximate position to the enemy search teams. Flashlight beams were now sweeping the ridge where Sarah and Jake were positioned. Enemy voices could be heard getting closer as multiple search teams converged on their location. They had perhaps 5 minutes before their position would be overrun. "Overwatch, this is Phoenix 1, Commander Torres transmitted. We can see teams moving through the pass. Outstanding work on the blocking position. But we still need support down here." Sarah shifted her scope back to the valley floor where the main SEAL group was still under heavy fire. They had managed to move closer to the rally point, but enemy fighters were pressing their attack aggressively. Several Americans were down, and the group was running critically low on ammunition. The enemy fighters attacking the main SEAL group were using the light from the burning supply area to coordinate their movements. Sarah could see them maneuvering to surround the Americans, using superior numbers to overcome the tactical disadvantage of attacking an entrenched position. Jake was monitoring their escape routes while Sarah engaged targets in the valley. "Contact, 300 meters, northeast slope," he announced. "Enemy search team is getting close." Sarah could hear voices and equipment noise from the approaching enemy fighters. They would be in visual range of the cave entrance within minutes. She needed to eliminate as many threats as possible before they were forced to abandon their position. Selecting targets carefully, Sarah engaged enemy fighters who were in key positions threatening the escaping SEALs. Each shot had to count because ammunition was running low, and every muzzle flash brought the search teams closer to their location. Her fourth target was a mortar team that was preparing to engage the main SEAL group. The mortar position was partially concealed, but Sarah could see the crew preparing to fire. She eliminated the gunner with a precise shot, causing the remaining crew members to abandon the position. The fifth target was more challenging. An enemy leader who was coordinating the attack on the main SEAL group from a position near the burning supplies. He was moving frequently and using cover effectively, making him difficult to engage. Sarah waited for the right moment when he exposed himself to give orders to his fighters. When the opportunity came, Sarah's shot was perfect. The enemy leader dropped immediately, and the coordinated attack began to fall apart as individual fighters lost direction and purpose. Without leadership, the enemy force became less effective and more vulnerable to SEAL counterattacks. Commander Torres immediately recognized the opportunity and began leading his men in a breakout attempt toward the rally point. Using the confusion caused by the loss of enemy leadership, the SEALs began moving more aggressively toward their escape route. But the enemy search teams were now dangerously close to Sarah's position. Jake could hear individual voices and the sound of equipment being moved up the mountainside. They had less than 2 minutes before their cave would be discovered. "Time to go," Sarah announced as she began breaking down her rifle for movement. "We've done all we can from this position." Jake was already packing his equipment and preparing demolition charges to destroy any evidence of their presence. The charges would also create confusion among the search teams, hopefully buying additional time for their escape. As they prepared to move to their final alternate position, Sarah maintained communication with the SEAL teams. Most groups had successfully reached the rally point and were beginning the long trek through the mountains to the extraction zone. But the main group was still fighting its way out of the valley. The third alternate position was located on a different ridge entirely, requiring a dangerous traverse across open ground that would expose them to observation from multiple enemy positions. But it was their only option if they wanted to continue providing support for the escaping Americans. Moving carefully through the darkness, Sarah and Jake used their night vision equipment to navigate the treacherous mountain terrain. Behind them, they could hear enemy fighters discovering their abandoned position and the subsequent confusion as Jake's demolition charges detonated. The explosions created additional chaos among the enemy forces, as some units thought they were under attack from a larger American force. Radio chatter increased dramatically as different enemy groups tried to coordinate their response to multiple threats. From their new position, Sarah could see that most SEAL teams had successfully escaped from the valley and were moving through the mountain passes towards safety. The elimination of key enemy positions had created the opening they needed to break out of the trap. But Commander Torres and the main group were still engaged in a running firefight as they tried to reach the rally point. They were carrying wounded teammates and could not move as quickly as the other teams. Enemy fighters were pursuing them aggressively, trying to prevent their escape. Sarah realized that this would be her final opportunity to influence the outcome of the battle. From her new position, she had a clear view of the pursuit force threatening the main SEAL group. But the range was extreme even for her specialized equipment. The pursuing enemy force consisted of approximately 40 fighters led by the replacement commander who had taken over after Sarah eliminated the original leader. They were moving quickly and using good tactics, staying spread out, and using cover effectively as they pursued the Americans. Through her scope, Sarah could see that the enemy pursuit force would intercept the main SEAL group before they could reach the safety of the rally point. The Americans were slowed by their wounded teammates and were almost out of ammunition after hours of sustained combat. Jake set up his equipment and began calling range and wind conditions for the extreme distance shot. The pursuing enemy force was at the absolute limit of Sarah's rifle range, and the mountain wind conditions made accuracy nearly impossible. But Commander Torres and his men needed help, and Sarah was the only person in position to provide it. She settled into her firing position and prepared to attempt shots at a range that most snipers would consider impossible. The radio crackled with one final transmission from the main SEAL group. Overwatch, this is Phoenix 1. Enemy is closing fast. If you can see us, we need help now. Sarah could see both the Americans and their pursuers through her scope. The distance was extreme, the wind conditions were terrible, and she had limited ammunition remaining. But 200 American warriors were depending on her ability to make impossible shots under impossible conditions. She settled her crosshairs on the lead enemy fighter and began her final engagement of the longest night of her military career. Everything she had trained for, everything she believed in, came down to this moment on Christmas Eve in the mountains of Afghanistan. The shot was at the very edge of what physics would allow. At 1,380 meters, Sarah's bullet would drop over 40 feet during its flight time, and the swirling mountain winds could push it several feet in any direction. But, through her scope, she could see Commander Torres and his men struggling up the mountainside with their wounded teammates while enemy fighters closed the distance. Sarah's breathing slowed to almost nothing as she made her final calculations. Wind speed, air density, temperature, the angle of the slope, even the rotation of the Earth had to be considered for a shot at this extreme range. Her finger found the trigger as she settled the crosshairs on the lead enemy fighter. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, and Sarah immediately began tracking the target through her scope. For almost 3 seconds, she waited as the bullet traveled through the thin mountain air. Then, the lead pursuer stumbled and fell, causing confusion among the fighters behind him. Without hesitation, Sarah chambered another round and acquired her second target. The enemy fighters were now aware they were under fire, but they could not determine the direction or distance of the threat. Some took cover while others continued pursuing the Americans, unsure of what was happening. Sarah's second shot struck another enemy fighter, and panic began to spread through their ranks. The replacement commander was shouting orders, trying to maintain control, but his men were confused and frightened by the invisible threat that could reach them at impossible distances. Jake was calling out wind changes and target information as Sarah continued engaging the pursuit force. Each shot was at the absolute limit of her equipment and training, but her years of experience and exceptional skill were making the impossible shots possible. Her third shot missed due to a sudden wind gust, but the fourth found its target. The enemy pursuit force was beginning to break apart as fighters sought cover and tried to locate the source of the deadly accurate fire. Their aggressive advance had turned into a cautious retreat. Commander Torres recognized the opportunity immediately. All Phoenix elements, enemy pursuit force is taking casualties from unknown source. We're making our final push to the rally point. Move now. The main SEAL group increased their pace, carrying their wounded teammates toward the safety of the rally point while enemy fighters were distracted by the sniper fire. The elimination of key leaders and the confusion caused by long-range fire had given them the opening they needed. Sarah continued engaging targets until her ammunition was exhausted. Each shot had been carefully placed to maximize the psychological impact on the enemy force. Rather than simply trying to eliminate every fighter, she had focused on leaders and key personnel whose loss would create the most disruption. The strategy worked perfectly. The enemy pursuit force had lost cohesion and was no longer effectively pursuing the escaping Americans. Some fighters had withdrawn entirely, while others were hiding behind rocks and refusing to advance into the open where the mysterious sniper could engage them. Overwatch, this is Phoenix 1, Commander Torres transmitted. All elements have reached the rally point. We're beginning movement to the extraction zone. Thanks for the cover, whoever you are. Sarah smiled as she began breaking down her rifle for the final time. After 12 hours of continuous operations, all 200 trapped SEALs were safe and moving toward extraction. The mission that had started as a disaster had become a remarkable success story. Jake was monitoring radio traffic to ensure that all SEAL teams were accounted for and moving safely through the mountains. The extraction zone was still 8 miles away through difficult terrain, but the immediate threat had been eliminated. As they prepared to begin their own movement toward the extraction point, Sarah reflected on the events of the night. The shot that everyone had feared she might have to take had actually been dozens of shots, each one critical to saving American lives. The enemy forces in the valley were beginning to reorganize, but their leadership structure had been decimated and their supplies destroyed. It would take hours for them to mount any effective pursuit, giving the escaping Americans a significant head start. Sarah and Jake began their own movement toward the extraction zone, using predetermined routes that would keep them away from enemy patrols. They had accomplished their mission, but they were not safe until they reached friendly lines. The mountain terrain was treacherous in the darkness, but both operators were experienced in night movement through difficult country. They used their night vision equipment and careful route planning to avoid detection while making steady progress toward safety. Behind them, the burning enemy supply area continued to light up the sky. Secondary explosions still occurred occasionally as ammunition cooked off in the intense heat. The fire would burn for hours, serving as a beacon that marked the site of the Christmas Eve battle. As dawn began to break over the mountains, Sarah could see American helicopters in the distance, approaching the extraction zone to pick up the rescued SEAL teams. The sight of friendly aircraft meant that the nightmare was finally over. Radio communications indicated that all SEAL teams had successfully reached the extraction zone and were being lifted out by helicopter. Medical teams were treating the wounded, but all 200 Americans who had been trapped in the valley were alive and safe. Sarah and Jake reached their own extraction point as the sun came up on Christmas morning. They had been in continuous combat operations for over 14 hours, but their mission had been completed successfully. Not a single American life had been lost after Sarah began her sniper support. The helicopter ride back to base gave Sarah time to decompress from the intensity of the night's operations. She had fired 37 rounds and scored 34 hits at ranges from 400 to 1,380 meters. Each shot had been critical to saving American lives. Commander Torres was waiting at the base when Sarah's helicopter landed. He approached her as she stepped off the aircraft, extending his hand in greeting. "You must be Overwatch," he said with a smile. 200 American warriors owe their lives to your shooting last night." Sarah shook his hand and looked at the SEALs who had gathered to thank her. These were some of America's finest military personnel, and they had been saved by precision marksmanship and careful planning during the darkest hours of Christmas Eve. The official report of the operation would be classified for decades, but the story of the female sniper who saved 200 SEALs on Christmas Eve would become legend within the special operations community. Sarah had proven that exceptional skill and courage could overcome impossible odds. In the months that followed, Sarah would receive multiple decorations for her actions during the Christmas Eve battle. But the greatest reward was knowing that 200 American families had their loved ones home for Christmas because of her ability to make the shots that everyone feared. The enemy forces had planned the perfect ambush in an ideal location with overwhelming numbers and superior firepower. But they had not planned for Sarah Chun, a female sniper with exceptional skills and the courage to take impossible shots when American lives hung in the balance. The battle in the Afghan mountains had lasted only one night, but it had changed the lives of everyone involved. 200 SEALs had escaped certain death, and Sarah had proven that sometimes one person with the right skills in the right place could change the outcome of any battle. Years later, when people asked Sarah about the most difficult shot of her career, she would think back to that Christmas Eve in the mountains. It was not any single shot that had been the most difficult, but rather the decision to take responsibility for 200 American lives and do whatever was necessary to bring them home safely. The shot that everyone feared had become the shot that everyone celebrated. On Christmas Eve in Afghanistan, a female sniper had fired the shots that saved 200 of America's finest warriors and brought them home for Christmas.